Hi everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the virtual book launch for Engaging the African Diaspora in K-12 Education. This anthology was published by Peter Lang in April of this year, and we are very excited to have you join us this evening for a timely and important conversation with several of the book's contributors. I'm Kia Caldwell, and I'm a professor of African, African American, and Diaspora Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I'm also the director of the African Diaspora Fellows Program, which Engaging the African Diaspora in K-12 Education was an outgrowth of. I will be co-moderating our discussion tonight with Emily Chavez. Emily and I co-edited Engaging the African Diaspora in K-12 Education, and also co-founded and co-directed the African Diaspora Fellows Program for several years. I want to give special thanks to the Department of African, African American, and Diaspora Studies at UNC-Chapel Hill, along with the Carolina K-12 program for co-hosting this webinar. Special thanks to Dr. Eunice Saleh, Rachel Barrera, Christy Hinton, and especially to Paul Bonici for his technical and logistical support and for being with us behind the scenes today during the webinar. I'll turn things over to Emily Chavez.
Hello, everyone. I'm Emily Chavez, and we are pleased to have you with us tonight. I'm the other co-editor of this book, and we just hope that the talks that you hear tonight will inspire some fresh outlooks on curriculum and on the structure of the schools, districts, and systems within which you work and are raising children. I currently serve as the Director of Equity and Justice at Duke School, an independent school in Durham, North Carolina, and I serve as the co-director of ADFP, the African Diaspora Fellows Program, with Kia from 2014 to 2018.
So as I briefly mentioned earlier, Engaging the African Diaspora in K-12 Education was an outgrowth of work that Emily and I did as co-directors of the African Diaspora Fellows Program, or what we call ADFP. We founded ADFP in the fall of 2014 with colleagues from UNC-Chapel Hill and Duke, as well as from the Durham Public Schools and the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction Social Studies team. And it was founded as a way to enhance teaching about the African diaspora and to build capacity among teachers in this important yet often neglected area. We were aware of the gaps in middle and high school education, especially in areas such as social studies and world languages. As the program developed, we also expanded our focus to include English language arts teachers. While ADFP was successful in reaching a small group of teachers throughout the state of North Carolina in 2015 and 2016, we realized that substantially more work needed to be done to increase teachers and students' exposure to the histories, cultures, and politics of African descendant communities in regions such as Latin America, Europe, and Asia. Recent events in the United States and globally highlight the importance of having accurate historical information about Black communities, as well as addressing how systemic racism shapes the educational system in multiple ways, from textbooks to teacher training and funding for schools. As someone who has taught at the college level for 20 years, I am aware of the incomplete and distorted information about African Americans and other African descendant communities that many students enter college with. When they begin to learn a more full and accurate version of history, students also often feel that they have been robbed and cheated. Launching the African Diaspora Fellows Program 6 years ago was an effort to address the omissions, erasures, and misinformation that shape what is known and not known about people of African descent. The book, Engaging the African Diaspora in K-12 Education, was completed, published, and is now being launched at a pivotal time in US and global history. The book went to press in 2019, a year which marked the 400th anniversary of the first arrival of Africans in Virginia. Recent news coverage of the 1619 Project, spearheaded by UNC alum and Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter Nicole Hannah-Jones, and Senator Tom Cotton's efforts to keep the project out of schools, as well as his recent remarks about slavery being a Necessary Evil, highlight the importance of making accurate historical texts and perspectives available to students and teachers. They also highlight the ways in which ideas and historical knowledge continue to be important political battlegrounds. Fortunately, today, we are joined by Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, a renowned historian who has spent many years researching 1619 and related developments in Virginia. Her chapter in Engaging the African Diaspora offers a timely and important analysis of the African presence and contribution to colonial Virginia. Another recent development that highlights the importance of the topics covered in the book is the release of ancestry data by 23andMe that sheds light on the history of African enslavement in the Americas. An article titled Genetic Consequences of the Transatlantic Slave Trade in the Americas was published by the American Journal of Historical Genetics on July 23rd of this year and is available online. While data in the article highlight facts about the transatlantic slave trade and the sexual violence that enslaved women experienced for a broader public, some scholars have critiqued the data and how it has been framed because it does not adequately account for the presence of enslaved Africans in areas of Latin America, such as the Andean region, including places like Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. As projects that attempted to address the continued invisibility of Afro-Latin Americans in middle and high school teaching, ADFP and Engaging the African Diaspora in K-12 Education both have a strong focus on Afro-Latin Americans. The book contains several chapters and a dedicated section on Afro-Latin Americans. We are also happy that Dr. Chris Busey and Elizabeth Milligan Cordova could be with us today to share material from their chapter on Afro-Latin identity and US history courses. In closing, I'd just like to mention that today a letter was published in the New York Times by the late Representative John Lewis that I'd like to share part of. He stated in this letter, which he asked would be released on the date of his funeral, in this letter he says, ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America by getting in what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. You must also study and learn the lessons of history because humanity has been involved in this soul-wrenching existential struggle for a very long time. People on every continent have stood in your shoes through decades and centuries before you. The truth does not change, and that is why the answers worked out long ago can help you find solutions to the challenges of our time. Continue to build union between movements stretching across the globe because we must put away our willingness to profit from the exploitation of others.
Thank you, Kia. ADFP and this book project have been marked by many significant moments. In the fall of 2014, when Kia and I first met and started working together, it was 2 months after the murder of Mike Brown in Minneapolis, a season when people across the US were calling for systemic change in response to the ongoing disregard for Black lives. When we held our first ADFP summer workshop in June of 2015, it was in the same month that Bree Newsom climbed the flagpole at the South Carolina State House to remove the Confederate flag. It was also the same month a young white man murdered 9 members of Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And this summer, we are holding this book launch during this current time of transformation, during what has been named as the largest movement for civil rights since 1968. Many of you are educators, and you know that your teaching and the experiences of your students are taking place within a larger context. What happens in the classroom is always in dialogue with that which is taking place beyond it. ADFP was designed to provide professional development to middle and high school teachers. We sought to create a program that would allow teachers to challenge dominant narratives, to expand their knowledge of the African diaspora, as well as to think more deeply about how knowledge is produced, by whom and for what purpose. ADFP brought together university faculty, including many top scholars in their fields, teachers, and curriculum specialists. The African Diaspora Fellows who participated developed curriculum resource guides on various topics, including resistance during slavery and the Haitian Revolution. 3 of these are included in the book, and all of these are available for download. And we'll share a link where you can access them in a moment. To omit the cultural, political, and economic history of a group of people from the curriculum and the schools is a form of cultural genocide. We compiled this book with so many wonderful authors, many of whom were speakers, planning team members, or fellows in ADFP, with the idea in mind that Black students have a right to learn about Black histories. Latinx students have a right to learn about Latinx histories, which include Afro-Latin American identities, communities, and voices. And all students should have access to narratives that decenter whiteness, decenter the United States, and decenter all privileged identities. We are in this time of transformation right now, and people are calling for policy change, for economic change, for changes in representation. We need to recognize that this is a time of absolute transformation for our systems of education. Schools are literally in the news every day as school districts and individual schools try to figure out how they are going to organize schooling in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. The models of schooling right now are vast. It's amazing the amount of creativity that has gone into figuring out how we will educate children in this fall across the US. So what if we push to have that same level of creative and innovative thinking about racial equity in education, both in what we teach and how we teach? Let's imagine what our classrooms could look like, either virtual or in person. How could our classrooms become spaces where students learn about how Black intellectual thought has shaped communities? How could our classrooms be spaces where our Black students are affirmed as the dynamic, creative, and beautiful young people that they are? How could our classrooms be these spaces for all students of color? I urge you to allow what you hear this evening to inspire you to dream big for our children and to dream big for education. We can organize for these changes in our communities. We have tremendous possibilities in front of us. We're going to share just very briefly. Sorry for the dog. Dogs. So we wanted to share our about the African Diaspora Fellows Program. This is just a list of our contributors, or our collaborators rather. And the website is there at the bottom for the African Diaspora Fellows Program. And there is a link to all of the curriculum resource guides on that website. The African Diaspora Fellows Program also now has a Facebook page, so please look for that and check that out. We wanted to just recognize all of our contributors. We have 25 chapters in the book, and they're all wonderful. So we hope that you will explore all the different perspectives and pieces that our contributors wrote. And we wanted to also share just what the book covers. These are the different sections of the book. You can see we tried to cover a lot of different aspects of the African diaspora. And some of the articles are more scholarly and some of them are more practitioner based. And then we have the curriculum resource guides as well. So I will stop there and pass it back to Kia.
Thanks, Emily. So the format for today is to have each of our speakers speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a final round of questions for the speakers. So if you would like to submit a question, please enter it into the question Q&A section of Zoom if you're on Zoom with us. And we will try our best to get to as many of those questions as possible during the final 20 minutes or so of our book launch today. And I really want to thank all of our speakers. We have speakers here, of course, from North Carolina, but also from Virginia, Florida, Ohio, and Colorado. And our first speaker is Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. She's the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, a professor of history, and the director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center for African Diaspora Studies at Norfolk State University. University. Her book publications include Virginia Waterways and the Underground Railroad, which was published in 2017, and African American History of the Civil War in Hampton Roads, published in 2010. She co-authored the Black America series on Portsmouth in 2003. She also authored the book Hampton Roads, Remembering Our Schools in 2009, and co-edited Voices from Within the Veil, African Americans and the Experience of Democracy in 2008. Dr. Newby-Alexander has appeared on a number of national programs and documentaries, including PBS's Many Rivers to Cross, the History Channel's Race, Slavery, and the Civil War, and C-SPAN's broadcast on history. The title of her chapter in Engaging the African Diaspora in K-12 Education is In Search of the 20 and Odd, Reclaiming the Humanity of America's First Africans in the Virginia Colony. Dr. Newby-Alexander.
Thank you so much, Kia. And I wanted to thank the co-authors, Emily and Kia, for allowing me to participate in this book. And I am going to get started with my presentation. I wanted to really start with looking at, having you look at the site. So I'm framing my discussion on the first Africans who arrived in what would be the Virginia colony. At the time in 1619 in late August, it was still in some cases called the Jamestown colony. And these 32, a total of 32 Africans, the first group was about 20 to 22, they forcefully arrived at what we call Old Point Comfort, which is where Fort Monroe is located. Ironically, the same place where enslaved men who escaped from a Confederate colonel on the site of what is today the Norfolk Naval Station in Norfolk. They escaped, came to Fort Monroe, and demanded protection and sanctuary because they did not want to continue to help the Confederacy. And as a result, they were declared contrabands of war. And this is what started America on the trajectory of ending slavery. So here you have a site where the first unfree people were forced to arrive. And this is also the site that began the end of slavery. So I think those two arc points are very important. If you go to Fort Monroe today, you will see this particular marker. You will also have an opportunity to go into their visitor center where they are interpreting this history. And it is an incredible history that is still being examined today. And there are new things that historians are uncovering. But I'd like to begin with this idea, and this is what I really pointed out in my chapter, is taken from Ralph Ellison, where he asked the question, what would America be like without the Negro? And I think that's such an important question because for so long, the American narrative is filled with silences on the role of Africans. Why is it that these Africans who were forced to come here were not considered part of this founding group of people who settled in the Virginia colony? Their lives, their voices, their skills and techniques, their contributions, their struggles are all part of our narrative. And it's those struggles that helped America to define what freedom really is. And yet we have so many silences. What I tried to do is really tell this story, but start with an understanding, first of all, that Africans, West Central Africans who were brought here, they came fully clothed with their culture. They came fully clothed with with techniques and with skills and with ideas about things. And those ideas helped the Virginia colony to develop its transportation system that was guided through the waterways. Their skills and techniques helped to create specific architectural designs for the houses, for the buildings. They helped to construct the colony. And as the colony expanded, even though they were small in number, their struggles to obtain freedom resulted in a construction of laws that would enslave them. What we saw from the beginning was that they were simply discriminated against, and they were treated not necessarily as enslaved people, but certainly they were treated with quite a bit of discrimination. And their color was a marker in so many ways in the legal world, as a symbol or a marker of the other. And we would see one of the first cases in 1840, Henry John Punch, highlight that, where John Punch was an African man who ran away with 2 white indentured servants. They were all captured, but his punishment was permanent servitude. And so that demarcated him from others. Now, many people, they think of Africa as a country, not a continent. And I wanted to put this particular moment in time in 1619 within the larger landscape of what was happening in the world. And so the American colonies really were founded at a time when enslavement and the transatlantic slave trade and the transportation of people and their cultures to the Americas as well as to Europe was already well established. And it was the West Central Africans who were at the foundation or the focal point of the transatlantic slave trade. And I gave some numbers here that of the 91,000 West Central Africans who would eventually be transported to the American colonies between 1619 and 1810, 22,000 came to Virginia. And this data really is what the project looking at 23andMe is trying to decipher, why so many people seemingly have more ancestry coming from the Nigerian area as opposed to some of the other areas. And so understanding this, it really lays the foundation of the names of people, of the cultural practices that were part of how America was really founded, because Virginia would actually export its newfound culture to the other colonies. And so these people who came from West Central Africa, we know that the first group of Africans who were brought here came from the kingdom of Ndongo at a time when the Portuguese were actually raiding, using their armies to raid the kingdom of Ndongo. They broke through their fortresses, and they were using mercenaries, local mercenaries, to help them in their war against that area. And people were taken from their cities and towns, marched to the Luanda port and exported. And about 350 were exported out of Luanda, and they were headed to the Veracruz slave port. But it would be on the way there that we would see something else happen. Now, many of you are familiar with Queen Nozinga, who came after this time period. She is the one who helped regain that power and authority of the kingdom of Ndongo that was lost. And she would actually go through many, many years of ongoing fighting with the Portuguese. And I wanted to show you this picture because I thought it was important to look at how the Europeans were seeing these Africans and the world in which they lived, because there was at least an element of reality in the way that they visualized these people. And you could see the culture. And one of the aspects of the culture is that they had already started incorporating some of the European cultural elements within their culture as a way of establishing political relations with them, not because they envy that particular culture. We know that this time period was also caught up in a massive war in Europe, the 30 Years' War, and that it was Prince William who would be involved in helping to create pirating from the English perspective in the Americas. In fact, it would be the in here we have a picture of the kingdom of Ndongo and what was going on in the Luanda port. It would be in this time period that we would see two ships, the Treasurer and the White Lion. These were two privateers that would capture the San Juan Bautista, which is the one that left the Luanda port, and they would attack the ship and take about 100 people off of that ship and set sail for Virginia. And I just wanted to say that the Treasurer, one of the ships, the Treasurer, was actually owned by the London Company of Virginia. So there was some intentionality here to somehow provide some support to the Virginia colony. They would arrive at Point Comfort, and here's a map. This is from the John Smith map that shows you Point Comfort, but it also shows you that this is the territory controlled by the Powhatan Indians, who were Algonquin Indians. And this is the first documentation that we have of this first arrival. And John Rolfe actually met the ship along with his father-in-law, who he married this woman after Pocahontas died, and his name was William Pierce. And they met the ship at Point Comfort. And that's why, of course, he knows a lot about it. And his father-in-law would actually purchase three of the people who first arrived. And those individuals who arrived would be placed, because they were purchased by the leadership of the colony, they were placed all along the James River, because the settlements simply took over a lot of the areas that the native peoples had. And so what I did was I found where were the locations of the people who were placed throughout the James River plantations, and who were the leaders. And all of these men who were the leaders were also the ones who founded the legislative body a month before the first Africans arrived, and they would be the ones who would actually pass legislation eventually to enslave all of these people. And lastly, I wanted to mention that there's a lot of work going on currently looking at these first Africans. There's an archaeological dig that's going on in historic Jamestown, where they're digging on the site where one of the first Africans, Angela, lived. And hopefully they're going to find some evidence of her existence. In fact, they found 3 graves so far, and they know that the people buried in those graves were not Europeans. And those graves date back to this time period. And so if you have a chance, go to that site. Here's another map that just shows you these locations today, from Newport News all the way up to Richmond, of where many of these early Africans were settled, where they lived. And of course, we know some of them, like Anthony Johnson and his wife, Mary Johnson. They were on one of these early plantations, and eventually they were freed within 8 years of being in the colony, and they established their plantation on the eastern shore of Virginia. And so I hope that my article will help at least bring some knowledge about this very important and early period. And I encourage all of you to come visit the Hampton Roads area to learn more about this history and to actually walk the grounds where the first Africans were. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. We are now going to move to Holly Jordan. And Holly Jordan has been a public school teacher for 14 years, all of them at Hillside High School in Durham, North Carolina, where she teaches International Baccalaureate English advises the Hillside Gender and Sexuality Alliance, and mentors pre-service teachers through the Duke Master of Arts in Teaching program. She received her Bachelor of Arts in Secondary Education and English at Concordia University, Wisconsin, and is a National Board Certified Teacher. Holly is also a former chair of the Safe Schools NC Board of Directors. As a white, cisgender, able-bodied, middle-class woman, Holly came of age in Illinois and Wisconsin with little understanding of systemic racism or of her own privilege. Her experience teaching the phenomenal students of Hillside High, Durham's historically Black high school, changed the trajectory of her life. Now she is an active learner and teacher of racial and social justice, both inside and outside of the classroom. Her chapter in Engaging the African Diaspora in K-12 Education is called Teaching as Everyday Resistance.
Hi, everyone. My name is Holly Jordan, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I want to express so much thanks to Kia and Emily because the African Diaspora Fellow Program, of which I was a part in 2016, and the subsequent book have been really valuable experiences for me as a white person striving to be anti-racist. I'm happy to be here tonight as a learner because my learning in this area must be ongoing and lifelong. My chapter in the book is called Teaching as Everyday Resistance, and I also wrote a curriculum guide included in the book called Resistance Rhetoric, Analyzing Activist Texts from Abolition to Black Lives Matter. Tonight, as I focus on teaching as everyday resistance, I'm going to talk about what everyday resistance is, what it looks like in the classroom and why we need it, and how I hope to carry forth everyday resistance in the coming school year and beyond. So resistance, first of all, what is everyday resistance? Resistance itself is an unmistakable part of the history of the African diaspora. We're used to hearing lots about big forms of resistance, whether it's revolts led by enslaved people like Nat Turner, or the Montgomery bus boycotts, or the Stonewall Uprising, or Black Lives Matter protests. All of these acts of resistance are truly extraordinary. We don't get as many stories about everyday resistance. I was introduced to this concept when the African Diaspora Fellows visited Durham's Stagville plantation. While there, our tour guide, Beverly McNeil, showed us bricks made by enslaved people, including a few with very prominent fingerprint and thumbprints planted on them. She suggested that enslaved people sometimes left these marks intentionally. This struck me as an incredible act of everyday resistance. It was a brave reminder of personal identity and humanity in the most dehumanizing situation possible. Perhaps even just for a second, it allowed the enslaved resistor to gain a bit of power and resilience. Everyday resistance, or the small everyday actions that people take to stand against systemic oppression, is for everyone. So I hope that everyone gathered here tonight can consider how to incorporate acts of everyday resistance into your daily lives. As I focus on the context of education, I'm defining everyday resistance as the small everyday actions that educators and students take to stand against oppression in order to affirm our students' humanity and encourage their power. So there are several reasons why educators and students need to practice everyday resistance in the classroom. The first is that everyday resistance challenges problematic dominant narratives. For students from marginalized backgrounds, oftentimes their deep culture, in other words, their worldview, their values, their beliefs, are at odds with dominant culture. Teaching that is truly culturally responsive must honor the deep culture of our students. But a lot of times teachers are encouraged to be neutral or to leave politics out of it. But in reality, that's not possible. There is no neutral. You're either disrupting or enforcing the dominant narrative. So for example, in my classroom, there's a dominant ideology in society about the American dream. that it's equally accessible to everyone via hard work. When our class reads Fences by August Wilson, we analyze that narrative, who created it and why, and to what extent it is true. In that way, literary analysis of a text pairs easily with a critique of dominant ideology. Furthermore, everyday resistance validates students' identity, humanity, and power. The poet Adrienne Rich said, when someone with the authority of a teacher describes the world and you are not in it, there's a moment of psychic disequilibrium, as if you looked in the mirror and saw nothing. Conversely then, acts of everyday resistance that address students' realities can help students see themselves, reflect, and grow. Validating students' identity and humanity can be simple as what I like to call micro-affirmations. If microaggressions are moments of subtle discrimination, then microaffirmations are moments of subtle validation. Microaffirmations can include things like classroom decor and in design, asking students their pronouns and the name they want to be called, and then making sure to pronounce and spell those names correctly from day one. Even though they're small, I've seen microaffirmations have a really big impact. I frequently hear students comment about the vibe of a classroom or a teacher, and a student's ability to feel safe and seen in a space is a big part of how they make those judgments. Cultivating classroom community in which students are able to authentically be themselves is absolutely an act of everyday resistance. Beyond microaffirmations, this can be done through actively involving students in maintaining classroom community, through establishing classroom norms together, or creating learning partnerships in which both the teacher and the students are seen as experts. Curriculum choices can also validate student identities. For the last 2 years, my 12th grade class has studied Janelle Monáe's film Dirty Computer as part of a semester-long look at confinement and freedom, in which we also read Frederick Douglass, Assata Shakur, Malcolm X, The Awakening by Kate Chopin, and the poetry of Nikki Giovanni. The film, which pairs Monet's music with a dystopian storyline, follows the protagonist, who's a queer Black woman, as she seeks freedom from the societal confinement afforded her because she has been deemed an outsider. I saw this film resonate with students who also saw themselves as outsiders. Here's a reflection from Josephus Shabazz, who's now a music education major at Norfolk State University. The dirty computer represents a person that is different and has flaws according to society. This relates to me because my life has been a societal contradiction. My name, my race, my childhood, and my outlook on life is one fine line of gray that I balance on. Joe goes on to reflect on what it would mean to be free from societal confinement by saying, freedom is the idea that society's harsh, absolute restrictions do not define who you are as a person. My hope for Joe and other students who engage with this kind of curriculum is that they more deeply understand their own value and power as a result of engaging with it. Ultimately, I believe that everyday resistance engenders resilience in young people. In the clutch of oppression, it can be really hard to maintain hope. Thus, everyday resistance can't just focus on what is wrong in the world, it must also focus on possibility and vision for a better future. One way this shows up in my classroom is through the use of restorative circles, in which students build community and connect with each other. I've watched students use these circles to process a myriad of difficulties, and I've also always watched them use the space to encourage and uplift each other to move forward. It's also important to use the classroom to help students move through trauma into action and joy. When we look at activist texts, whether it's the writing of James Baldwin, the films of Jordan Peele, or Beyonce's Lemonade album, they may be born out of oppression and trauma, but they're also born out of brilliance, genius, and beauty. Highlighting and practicing joy, purpose, and vision in the classroom is in and of itself an act of everyday resistance. So I think about moving forward with everyday resistance. The reality for many educators this fall, including myself, is that we'll be facing the challenge of practicing everyday resistance virtually. I cannot say I know how to do this well because it feels brand new, but I do know what I'll try. First of all, I know I need to consider equity when it comes to virtual access. Just because we give kids access to laptops and hotspots doesn't suddenly mean that conditions for everyone are equitable. And it'll be important to address students' physiological and safety needs before I ask them to learn. I'll also emphasize the building of community through icebreakers, one-on-ones with each student, virtual restorative circles, and encouraging self-care and joy in our virtual classroom. I also know I can't ignore current events in the classroom, and I think that applies to all teachers of all subjects and grade levels. As mainstream and white culture awaken to the reality of police violence against Black people, as we look toward a contentious election this fall, and as COVID continues to disproportionately impact Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, it is our responsibility to address those realities and the trauma that comes for them in our virtual classroom. My final thought about teaching resistance has always been the first and most important. We need to listen to young people. We need to learn from them, and we need to trust their experiences. If our classrooms and communities are going to be places where the powerful history of resistance continues, then we must always center the voices of young people as they develop their own plans for everyday and extraordinary resistance. Thanks.
Thank you, Holly. That was really wonderful modeling for us, I think, and tips for how to really approach the fall as we all get back to teaching at various levels. I'd like to move us forward now with our next set of speakers this time. They are Dr. Christopher Busey and Elizabeth Milligan Cordova. Dr. Christopher Busey is an assistant professor in the School of Teaching and Learning at the University of Florida, where he primarily teaches graduate courses in the critical studies of race, ethnicity, and culture. He is also affiliate faculty for the African American Studies program and the Center for Latin American Studies, where he coordinates the Education in the Americas Master's Specialization. Dr. Busey's transdisciplinary research broadly examines Black education across the Americas with a specific focus on hemispheric, civic, and citizenship formations. Dr. Busey has published over 15 scholarly articles and book chapters related to teaching and learning Black global histories, Black critical theory in education, and Afro-Latinxes in education. Elizabeth Milligan Cordova is the co-author of the chapter with Dr. Busey, and she's a teacher and teacher leader at Northeast Early College in Denver, Colorado. She teaches high school social studies, concurrent enrollment, and serves as a coach for a student voice and leadership program, working to decolonize social studies curriculum. She also serves as the president of the Colorado Council for Social Studies. Elizabeth attended Lake Forest College, where she earned her bachelor's degree in history and education, and Columbia University Teachers College, earning her master's of arts in social studies education. She is a James Madison Fellow from 2016. The title of their chapter is Transnational Blackness, Theoretical, Curricular, and Pedagogical Considerations for Contextualizing Afro-Latina and Latino Afro-Latinx Identity and U.S. History Courses.
All right, so again, I want to echo the sentiments of everyone on the panel and thanking you, Dr. Kia Caldwell and Emily Chavez for putting together this volume. Elizabeth and I have worked together over the years, some more intensely than others, to rethink and co-construct curriculum grounded in anti-racist and more specifically Black diasporic frames. And our chapter represents a slice of the work that we have done over the years. But overall, I think it captures some of the larger theories and perspectives from which we work from to inform practice. What we want to do today is to speak broadly to the context of our chapter and our work together collectively. over the years to begin to imagine some of the possibilities of teaching from Black diasporic and transnational Black perspectives in the high school social studies classroom. And so what I want to do before Elizabeth really sort of gets into the meat of what a lot of these conversations and discussions look like with her students. So I want to outline 3 things that are crucial for understanding the context of our work together. First, similar work to ours is often framed out of void or deficit. And I think we're seeing a lot of it now in this current social political context as we think about what this means for K-12 education moving forward, especially in the next month or so. And while research has made it clear that accurate and complete representations of Black history and global Black perspectives are lacking in K-12 curriculum, we wanted to approach this work from the lens of what our students and what our children deserve. And again, I'm echoing the comments of our previous presenters as well as some of our upcoming presenters based on the content of their book chapters. And so when you look at the body of scholarship from scholars like Joyce King, Gloria Booth, Cynthia Dillard, for example, they discuss a research agenda for Black education that demands an educational experience for Black youth that's grounded in heritage learning and diaspora literacy. Black youth especially deserve the right to know more about their histories and their civic possibilities beyond the master script and beyond the borders of nation state, as well as beyond the duality of oppression and liberation. And so as Elizabeth and I began to initially work together, this was some of the thinking that informed our co-construction of curriculum and pedagogical opportunities for students. Second, and perhaps this is a concept that doesn't feature at least explicitly in the book chapter, but is there implicitly, is that it's crucial to understanding that's crucial to understanding our curricular co-constructing is the idea of infusion versus centrality. And this is complicated. And again, research makes it clear that Black history is rarely taught in K-12 schools in the US. And when done so, the discussions are often additive or seen as some sort of addendum to a predetermined curriculum. And so our goal was to work more from the lens of centrality, or to move towards centrality, of centering US Afro-Latinx, Afro-Latin American, and Black transnational perspectives throughout the curriculum. And so thus, and I think what's consistent with the concept of diasporas itself is that in our work, we make an effort to suspend borders, right? Of attempting to work beyond the nation state for understanding concepts like citizenship or the denial of citizenship, but also suspending borders and learning about certain historical events or time periods that are subjected to narrow geopolitical treatments. Third and finally, our goal in working together, and again, what manifests in the book chapter, and this has been a focus of much of my early scholarship, has been to center Afro-Latinidad and Afro-Latin America in our efforts to realize a Black diasporic and transnational perspective in the teaching of secondary history. So as we note in the chapter, much of the effort to promote the teaching of Black history in K-12 education centers largely on the US. And so therefore, not only do we negate discourses about Africa itself, but we lose an opportunity for students to learn about the African diaspora in the Americas in its totality. And so relying upon texts such as the Afro-Latino Reader, which Elizabeth has a classroom set of, and I know that the Black Latinos Know Collective just held a special virtual event acknowledging the 10-year anniversary of this text. Centering text as such, research from anthropologists such as Dr. Kia Caldwell, sociologists, and historians was particularly crucial for students in learning about Blackness in the US through the lens of Black Latinidad. Is crucial for troubling temporal curricular narratives through Afro-Latino history, and complicating how the social construction of race is understood in the US, which does not often allow discursive space for the learning of Black Latinxes in the US, nor any Afro-descendant group across the Americas in general. And so I'm going to pass it to Liz, who's going to briefly talk about some of what this conversation looked like in her classroom.
And I want to acknowledge too, just that as we're working to sort of decenter white narratives in social studies education, acknowledging how many teachers have grown up in that education ourselves. And so having partners like Dr. Busey, like this amazing resource that's coming out now, has just been so important to teachers like me to be able to peel back those layers. And I so appreciated Emily's acknowledgement earlier this evening, just that the walls between our classroom and the world are fluid, quite literally right now, but always. And so as we approached this year, which was 2016, and considered how do we build a US history curriculum that is responsive, we were returning from a summer of the Orlando nightclub shooting, of the killings of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling and too many others. So to begin with, like, the 2-week reconstruction unit just wasn't appropriate. And so we really centered this idea of solidarity. And we're too responding to even some racial tension between different groups of students at the school that year, between some Mexican students and some Black students. So really built that in. And then this all came sort of to our pinnacle when we were talking about the civil rights movement and the Cold War, and how those are so traditionally separated into 2 units, which makes no sense and completely removes the context. And so we grappled with really big concepts. And I think this returns to what Chris said about just what our students deserve. And so we framed the Make America Great Again movement in terms of capitalism, Christianity, racial hegemony, and interest convergence, to really peel back the layers of what is meant by those words, and looking at the 1950s and 1960s specifically. All of our work culminated in students collecting oral histories from what at first seemed like a variety of different topics. Some students interviewed Chicano activists from the Denver community. Some of them interviewed people who were involved in a busing Supreme Court case in Denver. Other students were able to actually interview Devin Spence Benson, who's a historian on Latin America. And so they were able to begin to draw connections between these different movements and time periods, and began to blend the lines between this Black-white binary that we have created in the United States and a more international view. And so a few of the big takeaways were just that students were so able to tap into this idea of triple consciousness and navigating color lines both in their own like home country and then in the United States as well. And like really worked students towards voicing anti-essentialism. And one student really talked to her class about being from El Salvador, but always assumed to be Mexican. And then engaging in this habit of critique. Students began to ask questions about why Martin Luther King is so central to their education, but not Malcolm X. They had to ask questions about why it was hard. They also focused on the Black Panther Party as part of our unit, and they had to ask questions about why it was so difficult to find Black Panther Party members in Denver to interview. They actually had the privilege of speaking to Sandy Seal, who's the sister-in-law of Bobby Seale, and convinced her to call Bobby Seale on the phone, and were able to conduct an interview there too. And then just to watch how that empowered students to speak to people both in their communities and in their history textbooks was so powerful to watch as well. And I think the last point I'll make is that this was messy. It was imperfect in our first year, but it was so important because we threw out the traditional Cold War and civil rights movement curriculum that I was being asked to teach, and really were able to center something different this time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris and Elizabeth. That's exciting work. And we are now going to move to Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock. Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock is originally from Goldston, North Carolina. In 2018, she earned her doctorate at UNC-Chapel Hill in the Policy, Leadership, and School Improvement Program. Her research interests are critical race theory, Whiteness Studies, White Children's Racial Identity Construction, and Anti-Racism. Prior to entering her doctoral program, Dr. Taylor Bullock taught English for almost 10 years at Hillside High School in Durham, North Carolina, where she now resides. In Durham, North Carolina, where she now resides. Dr. Taylor Bullock is the co-founder and lead curator of weare, which stands for Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education. As a nonprofit, weare works to equip children, families, and educators with the knowledge and skills necessary to understand the complexity of racism. weare uses a three-pronged approach to dismantle systemic racism in education and beyond by offering summer camps for children in rising 1st through 5th grade, workshops for families, and professional development for educators. Dr. Taylor Bullock is the wife of Dr. Daniel Calvin Bullock and mother of son Zion and daughter Zaire. Dr. Taylor Bullock's chapter in engaging the African diaspora in K-12 education is called Challenging Whitewashed Curriculum, a Critical Race Theory Approach.
All right, Emily, thank you so much for the introduction. And, you know, as with other presenters, just thanking you and Kia for the hard work and the patience and flexibility that I'm sure you all had to use in making sure everything came together. So thank y'all for this opportunity. Thank you to you all who are out there listening and watching. I just want to hold space and acknowledge that you all are tuning in and we don't know the stories that you're carrying into this moment. Many of us are, all of us really, are dealing with the global COVID-19 pandemic. And we're also in the midst of a racism pandemic. And you know, trying to make it and survive in our own spaces, not knowing how either of these pandemics have impacted us personally. But I just thank you all so much for tuning in and taking the opportunity to continue to learn and grow in the midst of everything that we're currently experiencing. As Emily noted, my name is Dr. Rhonda Taylor Bullock, and I'm the co-founder and lead curator of weare. weare stands for Working to Extend Anti-Racist Education. I'm going to talk a little bit about my chapter tonight, but I also wanted to share some about our organization. I just have a quick slide to give you all some information because many of you who are tuning in are continuing to look for opportunities to grow and to learn, to do this work, either as educators, as community members, or as parents. And I just wanted to share two things that weare does that aligns with what we're talking about this evening. One is for an event that has already happened, but because we're virtual now, we're considering offering this institute again. We do something at weare, it's called a 3-day Educator Summer Institute, where we bring primarily educators together, but we have parents, community members, business leaders, people connected to religious spaces who come together for 3 days and talk about how racism is structural and how it intersects with the educational system. And we encourage folks to come in teams of 3 because we spend time in the afternoons naming systemic racial inequity issues that are relevant in a local context. Curriculum is a part of a system. And so we're talking about curriculum a lot tonight. And so that's something that we do in that space. We're hoping to offer that again. We did it virtually because, you know, like many other people, we're not gathering in person, and doing it virtual means that we might also be able to offer it more than just in the summer. And so we hope to have information about that in the coming months. The other piece up here is we do, Emily mentioned that we do summer camps for kids in rising 1st through 5th grade. And so we do anti-racism work with kids through curriculum, through books and literacy. And so people ask us, you know, how are you having these conversations with young kids and getting a lot of asks to do the work. So we just decided to bring people to us for 2 days to learn about an anti-racism framework using critical race theory, which some of the panelists have already mentioned. And then we give the curriculum to folks who come so that they can go forth and be anti-racist, include the African diaspora, and be more thoughtful about how to do that in the curriculum. And this is geared primarily to kindergarten through 5th grade, pre-K really, through 5th grade educators. And that's something that we're going to be offering in the fall. It probably will be virtual. Right now we're planning for in-person, but within the next month or so, we'll go ahead and make the call about whether or not that will be virtual. So that's something that you all may be interested in participating in to continue doing this learning. So Emily mentioned that my chapter was called Challenging Whitewash Curriculum, a Critical Race Theory Approach. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about that chapter. So for one, I want to make it clear that I draw on a critical race theory framework. I'm a critical race scholar. I do critical whiteness studies specifically, and I study white people and white children's racial identity construction. And so I pulled from that lens and from that research in constructing this chapter. One of the things that, and thinking about critical race theory, and Derek Bell, who's one of the founders, talks about race must be centered with any structural analysis of inequity in our country. Like, we have to talk about the role that race is playing. And race and racism is more than just individual bigotry and bias. It's connected and is built into our systems, to our laws, and to our policies. And yes, this has a role in the education classroom. One of the things that I talk about in the chapter is that using CRT in education forces educators to consider how race, racism, and white supremacy impact our school systems. And one of the things, if you see the image up here, I talk about how using this CRT framework is like putting on these glasses and recognizing that race is a part of everything. Racism is systemic and endemic to our country. It's also a part of the curriculum that we teach in the school systems in which we work. I recently got some pushback on using a glasses framework or analogy, because people, the person said, you know, we need to be able to have these on always. You shouldn't be able to take it off. And so I'm still working on how to navigate that space of making sure this becomes a permanent part of ourselves and our identities. Also, in taking a CRT approach, we have to recognize as educators that our curriculum choices are part of a system. Curriculum is a system. It's a system that can perpetuate white supremacy and uphold it. It can also be used to dismantle it. And so it's imperative that we examine how race and whiteness in particular it reproduces inequity. And we as educators have to own that we've been participating in a system that does this. And that's one of the first, that's a very important step that we as educators have to own and recognize. So within the chapter, I talk about the importance of naming whiteness. We have to come to terms with, many of us were taught in a way where Eurocentric values and ways of life and heroes, that was the dominant narrative. It becomes so dominant, whiteness, and talking about white culture, white people, white ideas, it becomes so dominant and normalized that it renders it invisible, right? And so oftentimes people think, I'm just teaching the standards, right? Without asking, well, who wrote the standards? Who decided that these standards were important, right? Standards for whom? And so the presence of whiteness is so common, it's so normal. Again, it becomes invisible. And so when you bring it up, people want to push back on the idea that they're participating in this system because they can't see it. And sometimes it's a willful ignorance, right? People know it's there, but they're choosing not to believe, and they're choosing not to see, because to challenge what many people have always known to be true messes up people's disposition. It messes with their reality, and a lot of people aren't ready to do that work and to own that story. So when I talk about a whitewash curriculum, I'm talking about curriculum that centers a Eurocentric people or perspective, culture, beliefs. So it's not just centering those narratives. It's at the same time, it's an intentional minimization or minimizing and or erasing the contributions of people of color, right? So if people of color are included, they're minimum, they're in the background, they're not the dominant characters, they're the flat characters in a text, they're playing stereotypical roles. Oftentimes it's not authentic representation, particularly in an English context. It will be a white author talking about indigenous people, brown people, African people. And so it's not an authentic representation in that sense. And so as educators in the chapter, I challenge us to we have to name that whiteness is happening, that other cultures are being erased, and that this is a form of white superiority. and supporting white supremacy, which is hard for some people, it is jarring for some people, and at the same time, it's what's real, right? And so I tell people that when we do this, when we have these curriculum that center predominantly white people and their ideas and their beliefs and their values and their systems and their history, where they are the heroines, right? What it does is it contributes to the superiority of our white students and colleagues, and it also contributes to the inferiority of Black and brown folks in our identities. And so I don't know how many educators have wrestled with the role that that curriculum plays in identity development, in identity construction, right? When you're being taught through this lens where the white folks are the heroes, that the historians, they're the inventors, they're the saviors, they're all these things, you begin to think that people who aren't mentioned don't what? Matter. That's what we're conditioned to believe, that those people that aren't mentioned, they don't matter. And if you're mentioned, you matter. Now zoom out a little bit and put that in the context of a Black Lives Matter movement, right? So we have to make these connections of how what we're teaching in our classroom has larger implications than just, we're just teaching a lesson, we're just teaching the standards. And so what I really want us to focus on, like some of the bigger pictures, and I even look back and I'm critical of my own writing, I just want to make sure that we're thinking about, as educators, how are we decentering whiteness? How are we decentering some of this traditional Eurocentric curriculum, ways of thinking, ways of teaching, books? How are we questioning and bringing in a critical lens to what we are teaching, right? And so as we're decentering whiteness, it's like, what are we replacing it with? And some of our earlier panelists talked about this. We now need to be centering the Black, brown, indigenous people of color, marginalized communities. How are we centering their stories, their experiences, their gifts and talents, their ways of knowing, their ways of telling stories, their ways of existing. And so it has to be this, as we're decentering one, we have to be pulling in the other. And that's really what my chapter centers and focuses on. And so that's just a little bit of a brief overview of it and some of the work that we do as an organization in a much larger scale. If you'd like to reach us or contact me, my contact information is up there, organization's contact information, and ways that you can follow us through social media. So thank you all so much, and I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to be a part of this very important work in this very important moment.
Thank you, Rhonda. And it's always so great to hear you. We're going to move on to our final speaker, who is Dr. Hasan Jeffries. And he is an associate professor of history at The Ohio State University, where he has been teaching courses on the civil rights and Black Power movement for the last 18 years. He earned a BA in history from Morehouse College in 1994 and a PhD in American history with a specialization in African American history from Duke University in 2002. He is the author of Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt. Most recently, he edited Understanding and Teaching the Civil Rights Movement, a book of essays by leading civil rights scholars on how to teach the civil rights movement. He also wrote and narrated the 10-episode Audible original series, Great Figures of the Civil Rights Movement, which was released in February of 2020. In the classroom, he has won several major teaching awards, including the Ohio State University Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching, which is the university's highest award for teaching. Congratulations on that. Dr. Jeffries has worked on several public history projects, including serving as the lead historian for the 5-year, $25 million renovation of the National Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine Hotel in Memphis, Tennessee. He is also the host of the podcast, Teaching Hard History, American Slavery, a production of the Teaching Tolerance Division of the Southern Poverty Law Center, which just wrapped up its 2nd season. And I know this is all just wonderful work, and we're really fortunate to have all of you take time out of your schedules to be with us. So Dr. Jeffries' chapter is titled Challenging the Master Narrative, Teaching the Civil Rights Movement Accurately and Effectively. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Kia, and thank you, Emily. for bringing us all together, not only for the book, this wonderful book, but together this evening virtually, but it still feels like we're occupying the same room. So thank you very much. I spent a little time in Durham, North Carolina, going to Duke University. One of my good friends, one of my homeboys, was a graduate of Hillside. So it's nice to see Hillside representing here today, Hillside High School down in Durham. The title of my chapter was challenging the master narrative, and the master narrative is a normative view of looking at the civil rights movement. And so what I lay out in the piece is really sort of explaining up front, what is this normative view, sort of this king-centric approach that downplays, that overhypes nonviolence, downplays self-defense and the like, and then what do we need to do to not only deconstruct it, but then to replace it with, so that our students are actually engaging what actually happened, and doing so in a way that renders this history useful, especially given the current circumstances. And so what I want to do with the 7 or 8 minutes that I have is just highlight a couple of these key points that I make in the article itself. As you know, as Kia pointed out earlier, today was the homegoing service of John Lewis, and he surprised everybody on his way out the door by penning and having published a letter, very much in the tradition of Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Together you can redeem the soul of the nation. It's a powerful piece, a short piece, but a powerful piece that speaks to not only the challenges, the actual obstacles of racial oppression in the United States, the power of struggle, acknowledging that struggle, but then also encouraging young people to be agents of change. There is in this powerful, and I encourage everybody to grab it and read it. There's a couple things that he says that really speaks to some of the points that I try to make in my piece. And one of the things he says is that Emmett Till was his George Floyd, his Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor. And this is a really critical point. And where I start my piece is actually trying to make the point that we have to make clear to students in the classroom that white supremacy is the problem. White supremacy is an ideology. White supremacy as an ideology, white supremacy as the primary legacy of the institution of slavery, and white supremacy, as was already mentioned, as manifest not only in individual actions, but also in systems and structures. And that white supremacy is reinforced, whether it was from slavery or Jim Crow or today, by the use of racial terror and violence, stemming from the hands of extra legal forces, the Klan, ordinary white neighbors, and also, as we see today, from the police. And so there's a direct link from John Lewis talking about how white supremacy, the violence of white supremacy, touched his life by taking the life of Emmett Till, to white supremacy touching the lives of our students by taking the lives of folk like George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks, Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor. A couple of the things that I say that we have to do if we want to teach the civil rights movement accurately and effectively include looking at Black protests beyond the South, pushing beyond the boundaries of Dixie, to look at Black protests in New York, Brooklyn, where I'm from, Chicago, Wisconsin, out west, in the Midwest. Wherever you find Black folk, you are going to find Black resistance. And it's important that we don't limit our study and focus of civil rights activism and Black protests solely to the South, because when you do that, two things happen. One, the problem becomes the South, racism becomes regional, and we know it wasn't. We know racism was national. And then those acts of rebellion that look different than nonviolent civil disobedience, Black folk taken to the streets in Watts and Newark and Harlem and Rochester, suddenly that appears to be spontaneous and disconnected from a desire to create change in a long organizing tradition. You can't, if you only focus on civil rights activism in the South in the 1960s, then what you see in people taken to the streets in Minneapolis makes no sense today. So we have to move beyond the boundaries of Dixie. John Lewis was as close as you could get to a disciple of Martin Luther King as could possibly exist. But one of the issues with this master narrative is that it's King-centric. It's overly centered around King. And it's not even a good king. It's a limited king. It's a king frozen on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and not the radical king, the anti-Vietnam king, the anti-capitalism king. And so we have to get away from that, broaden the people who we examine, including moving beyond Baptist preachers to include people to include women, Ella Baker, to include local grassroots leaders. So looking beyond whose names are often aren't whole. So looking beyond MLK. We also have to look beyond the narrow framing of goals and objectives. The Black freedom struggle was about more than securing national legislation. There's a lot of conversation now about John Lewis and voting rights, and absolutely voting rights was critical, but there was an economic agenda. People were fighting for jobs. Even the March in Washington was about jobs and freedom. And so we have to look at both the civil rights and human rights goals and objectives that African Americans were fighting for. If we want to teach the movement accurately and effectively, we got to get beyond our obsession with nonviolence and look at the full spectrum of tactics and strategies, which include self-defense, which includes armed self-defense. In the long tradition of African American organizing, the default is a willingness on the part of African Americans to defend themselves. Nonviolence is a moment in time in which it really ascends to sort of center stage. And so we have to put that in its proper context. We can't be afraid of folk who are willing to stand up and defend themselves and claim at times their own Second Amendment rights. That allows us to look at Black folk taken to the streets as serious political thinkers and actors, and not merely frustrated folk willing to bent on destruction. A couple more important points I think are worth mentioning from the piece. One, we gotta look at more than just mobilizing events, more than marches and demonstrations, and look at organizing. Look at organizations like SNCC and CORE that went into communities, and the long hard work of bringing people out and bringing people together. That's that grassroots organizing work that is replicated and needs to be replicated even today. And we also have to reassess and reimagine what are victories and defeats. Victories look different. My book, Lowndes County, Alabama, looks at a community that was 0% African, 80% African American, 0 registered voters at the start of 1965. By the end of that next year, had not only succeeded in registering a majority of African Americans, but they formed their own independent political party, the first Black Panther Party. And although they ran 7 candidates for office to take control of the county courthouse, they did not win. Now, some people look at that as a defeat, but people on the ground said it was a victory just to get the Black Panther on the ballot. So we have to reassess what we consider to be victories as well as defeats. And the last point I want to turn back to John Lewis and that powerful letter that he penned. He wrote that when historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say it was he's speaking to young people now, your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. The key point here is that the civil rights movement, the Black freedom struggle, belongs on a continuum of struggle that extends backward in time. As we began talking about at 7 o'clock, 1619, when Black folk first emerged. It's not the beginning of a civil rights movement, but it's the beginning of a struggle for freedom. It's the beginning of a struggle for what I call freedom rights, civil rights, and human rights that extends through the civil rights movement into the present. And so our kids right now, as they come back to our classrooms, whatever those classrooms look like, they will have been observing what has been going on in the streets. And we have to provide a framework for understanding so that they can make sense of this important moment and know that they belong to a tradition of activism that is Black-led, but also has always had white allies, not enough, but they're there. And that the power to change is really is up to them. It's in their hands. They have that ability. And I think that's what John Lewis was trying to say in his final words. And that is what the critical lesson is of the civil rights movement. So This is, I think, useful history, but we got to teach it right in order to teach it effectively. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Hasan. Wow, this is such a wealth of ideas and inspiration, and we don't have much time, so I'm gonna get straight to the first question. So this question, there were a couple questions about curriculum standards. Where do you see opportunities for state curricula and curriculum standards to change, especially in such areas as social studies? And I wanted to pass it to Dr. Newby-Alexander first because of some of your work on the area, and then let folks popcorn in.
Thank you so much. So in Virginia, we are actually looking to revamp the standards and not just to add African-American history into the curriculum, but to infuse our narrative with African-American history. You cannot talk about the founding fathers without talking about the institution of slavery. You can't talk about the founding of America, the expansion of America, without talking about people of African descent who were a part of every aspect of our society and culture, and even the definitions that we take for granted: citizenship, freedom, the right to vote, the right to rally, the right to be who you are. Your very personhood has been attacked in this country. Think about the ministers who came from England and derided the very color of the skin of Africans, saying it was impossible for a Christian to be Black. And when you have all of that, and yet these are hailed as the heroes, as the founding fathers, we have to reconstruct the way in which we are using language, such as using words such as civilization and indigenous. And we need to see how racism has been infused in even the language, and restructure our language as well as our narrative. And we need people who will advocate for that. Teachers, whether it's at the college level, whether it's high school, whether it's at the the primary levels. All of these individuals need to advocate for a change, because this is not about politics. This is about truth, and it's about the reality of who we are. And so the question of who are we as Americans should be the central focus.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else want to say anything with regard to standards?
I'll chime in just a bit. Just standards has been a part of my research to some degree. And one of the things about standards that's important to know is the economic machine that is tied to with textbooks, right? And so when standards are created, the textbook publishing industry has an investment in what is written into those standards. And so oftentimes there's a pushback on any effort to rescript standards from the textbook industry, because this will force the textbooks to have to print and distribute thousands of more textbooks to whatever state it is that, you know, elects to revise their standards. So there's so many components to understanding standards. Some people might be in states, let's take for example, where their 10th or 11th grade US history course has an end of course exam. Those exams are generally or typically built on whatever those curricular standards are. And so some teachers feel as if they're operating under, I guess you could say, some form of figurative or metaphorical surveillance, where they feel tied to the standards because the standards are going to show up on that end of course exam to varying degrees, because that's how they get us, right? They don't always ask the questions that are there. And I think the research of Anthony and Kathleen Brown out of UT Austin, they did a piece called The Illusion of Inclusion. And what they got at was some of the language of standards, terms like including versus such as, and what that meant for that material to generate on that end of course or state assessment. So when the standard says including, the teacher is required to teach that information. And when the standard says such as, when they give that long list of examples, typically some sort of historical figure, that's not generally required to be taught. But how many teachers are aware of that? And how are we presenting pre-service teachers with this knowledge in their pre-service teacher education program?
Thank you so much. It looks like we can go a few minutes longer than we originally planned, so past 8:30, if that's a little bit past 8:30, if that's okay for our panelists. Okay, so I think we have at least a couple more questions. I'm going to combine two. One was to Holly Jordan, Holly, about whether you've gotten pushback from parents and how you've navigated that. And then there was a question to Liz and Chris about conservative norms in social studies, and Liz, specifically to you, how did you navigate what this person says they imagine were significant institutional hurdles and norms, either above you or maybe among colleagues, in carving out this space for students to sit with a different narrative of the 50s, 60s, and 70s?
I have a couple thoughts. First of all, I think that this idea of everyday resistance is actually great for revolutionary curriculum that doesn't cause huge waves, because instead of hijacking the curriculum, it's actually part of the curriculum. It's just a different lens on what the English standards that I would be teaching anyway. So I think everyday resistance is really something that fits well into making small pushes instead of things that freak parents or administrators or whoever out. And secondly, I think it's really critical to understand your teaching context. When I work with young teachers, I always recommend that they take some time to understand the culture of their school and the power structures of their school and their district, to understand how to use everyday resistance in a way that people will respond positively to instead of reject off the cuff. So in general, I just always think it's important to understand your teaching context. And I would recommend the first episode of a podcast. The podcast is called The Way Out is Back Through. It's made by a friend of mine, Michael Parker West. The Way Out is Back Through is the name of it. And the first episode of that podcast is all about why it's really crucial as educators for us to understand our teaching context.
I can add to that. I'm really blessed to have an incredible leader in my school who supports anything I want to do in terms of thwarting the curriculum. And that's really important to me. And part of me would say, like, go work for an incredible leader who serves that mission, but that's actually not what we need. We need people who are teaching this kind of curriculum in all contexts. And so the other thing I would just say is, Holly was so right earlier when she said there is no neutral. That does not exist. But I put histories in front of students. I put primary sources in front of students. I engage them in oral histories and conversations with community members. And so I don't draw conclusions for them. They are intellectuals and they're able to get there themselves. So there's that balance of not, like, I am actively working to be anti-racist in the classroom, and I'm not mysterious about that, but really just allowing students to get there themselves and continually ask questions about what a narrative could mean and how they impact our thinking.
Great. All right, we're gonna do one more question. And this one is about disrupting the white supremacy within a false narrative of neutral teaching or a neutral classroom. Let's hear from some folks. I would love if Dr. Taylor Bullock, you would start, and would love to hear Dr. Jeffries on this one as well.
Yeah, and I think as some folks had already mentioned, like there really isn't a neutral position in teaching. Everything that you decide to teach is political, and teaching is not apolitical. When you choose to teach one thing and you're not teaching something else, that's a political decision. That is not a neutral position. And a lot of people think, well, I'm just teaching what was taught to me. And I'm gonna come from a English background and English perspective. You know, some of the common books that are read in English classes, from Shakespeare to Hemingway to, I can't even think of Henry Ibsen. You know, people are like, well, that's what was taught to me. Well, when you're choosing to teach these white male, white centered narratives, you're purposely and intentionally, whether you own it or not teaching about indigenous culture. You're purposely not teaching about Black authors and brown authors. Like, that is a choice. We can't just say, well, I just taught this book because it was taught to me, right? We are upholding white supremacy when we do things like that. And I think we have to come at it with a critical piece about, what am I teaching? Why am I teaching it? What is the and talking about like the context of the authors that we choose. Like, what was the context in which they were writing? What is the context? What is their identity? Right? Because identity impacts what authors write, and it matters, right? And I think making that visible. So for one, just going back, no, there is no neutrality. When you choose to teach something, you're upholding some form. You could be upholding some form of oppression or bias, or you could be working to dismantle it. Like, we have to make that visible to educators, and so that we can own that. And I will also say that it's not just choosing Black and brown authors and putting them in the curriculum. Like, that's not enough, right? Because that's performative. We do need that, right? But that's easy. It's easy for me to switch out one author for another one. And that simplifies this process. And what that critical race theory perspective says, we have to question the systems, right? We have to question the structures. We have to make visible how power is being utilized through curriculum, right? And encourage folks to ask critical questions about what's being presented in front of them. So it's more than just, let's bring in this piece of African-American history, this piece of Latinx history. It's, all right, let's make visible the systems. Let's make visible power. Let's make visible race and gender, and then how they're all intersecting, right? And how are they connecting, like from a history and a social studies perspective, how are they connecting to laws and policies? And now how is that connected to oppression? And now how is that connected to our school system and how schools are funded? Like, building those connections for folks. That's how you make whiteness visible, and that's how you think about deconstructing it. Because otherwise kids will, because oftentimes in education we're taught, you know, everything is equal. You go to school, you get an equal education, and all of this hard work, rhetoric, work hard and you'll get X, Y, and Z. And then that makes kids question, particularly those from marginalized communities, well, my family worked hard, why didn't I get what my white classmate got, or what my white teacher got, right? Because we haven't made visible those systems. And so those are ways that I think, one, we have to name that there are no positions of neutrality in the ways that we choose what we teach. And that we have to also move beyond just putting in different types of groups and cultures, but then also making visible the systems and the power that's inherent.
That's what I mean. I agree fully with what Dr. Taylor Bullock said, and I would only add that, you know, as teachers, as educators, much like physicians, we don't take a Hippocratic oath, but Our primary obligation, we walk into a classroom, is to do no harm. And when we choose not to teach truth, when we choose not to speak truth in the classroom, then we are in fact doing harm. Our former president, Bill Clinton, I was minding my business, just trying to enjoy John Lewis's homecoming. And then here he come talking about Stokely Carmichael all crazy. Well, Stokely Carmichael, when he dropped that phrase, Black Power, he was down in Mississippi and he said, tell Mississippi all the scared Negroes are dead. And our students, our children who are out on these streets this summer, they are telling us that the scared students are gone. They're no more. The time for silence is no more. If you didn't know it before, you ought to know it now. And if you can't muster the courage to confront your administrators, if you can't muster the courage to confront your teachers, the same courage that these young people have mustered coming out to the streets day after day, week after week, month after month now, then you need to rethink your profession because the stakes are high. We're talking about life or death now. When we miseducate our children, we wind up with the people we have in power now. And that isn't just the consequences of that just aren't unfortunate. The consequences of that are life and death for a lot of people. And so we are duty bound to do what is necessary, regardless of the stakes, regardless of the personal cost, to educate, to inform, so that our children, who are not responsible for anything that has ever occurred in the past, they're not even responsible for what's happening right now, but they are absolutely responsible for what's going to take place tomorrow. And we are responsible for making sure that they are equipped with the knowledge to understand how we got to this place and the tools that are necessary to change it going forward.
It's a wonderful note to end on. Thank you all so much. We're gonna put up here real quick just everybody's contact information with their permission. If you would like to reach out to any of our speakers, they are making themselves available. We encourage you to get the book, to read the book, to access the book. I also wanted to mention that that the UNC Duke Consortium in Latin American and Caribbean Studies will have copies soon that will be available to teachers. And the African Studies Center at UNC-Chapel Hill will also have a copy that teachers can utilize. And we do encourage you, if you are buying the book, to purchase it from a Black-owned business or independent bookstore. So thank you all. Kia, do you want to say?
I just want to say thank you to everyone, and this will be archived on the Carolina K-12 website where it has been streamed, and so you can watch it there later. I just want to thank all of our speakers again for sharing truth in this critical moment, and wishing everyone all the best as we enter a new school year. Thank you again.